First of all, thank you very much to Conflux for organizing this really interesting discussions. I've been saying to people here that it's nice to be out of New York, but it's also really nice to hear different viewpoints. We tend to live in a bubble, and we hear the same views again and again. So it's been a really good opportunity for me personally, but also for my colleagues. Listening to Cyril, or listening to colleagues here, to Paul, in terms of different approaches on mediation, really reminded me how when it comes to the UN, about which I'm going to speak today, is really to say that, you know, we don't have one approach. We have different approaches on different kinds of conflicts and different kinds of situations. As a global organization that works with a range of regional organizations, with a range of different actors, in some places we're more active in mediation in terms of being a much more proactive, active mediator. In other places we facilitate. In other places we're very much in the back seat. And more, I think we look at each one of these situations in a different way. There is no one formula. And with regional partners, with sub-regional partners, sometimes with bilateral partners, we sometimes partner up, so in co-lead. Sometimes we're very much in the back and we advise. So part of what our team does is really try and gauge that, which is really the issue of process design, but also to gauge the level and degree of involvement that we would have on a specific mediation, including with the provision of experts, without actually taking away from the role of the lead mediator, who may be from some other organization. But that's just one point to put there, so that you keep that in mind as I speak, because that's really our starting point. Back in November, the new Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, hosted the first meeting of the High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, which is a group of 18 men and women, 9 men, 9 women, of fairly high stature, former presidents, former foreign ministers, people who've done a lot in their respective fields, but with most of their careers sort of behind them. And we had this very interesting discussion on the state of mediation today and on the state of conflict prevention today. And, you know, the Secretary General, who is quite articulate, sort of summed it up really at the end by putting it in terms of that we need to think about conflict or peace and security issues today in a triangle of on the one hand conflict prevention and mediation, on the one hand protection of human rights, which is central, but finally, and last but not least, ensuring that national sovereignty is upheld. And those three things are actually quite difficult, and sometimes they come into clash with each other. But getting that right and trying to basically work with all three is really our starting point, or our base, or our fundamentals. And I think it's a good way of sort of encapsulating the whole problem. I wanted to say a few things about some of the tools we use at the UN. And some of the various instruments we have, and then I'd like to speak a little bit about some of the challenges we're facing in the field of mediation. I think as a start, we have to say that our entire work on mediation is very much based on prevention, an overall conflict prevention strategy, which is, I mean, it's the strategy of the United Nations, very much the personal strategy of the Secretary General himself as well. And on prevention, I think it's one thing to remember is that, you know, we always talk about how we could prevent conflicts better if we had warning, if we had earlier warning, if we knew in advance that something was going to pop up or something was going to explode in our faces. And over time, we've come to the conclusion that the issue, in fact, is not early warning. We have enough instruments, tools, knowledge in the system that you do know when a conflict is brewing or when something is coming up on the horizon. We do know when in a country a leader stays in power for too long and doesn't want to leave, that will eventually possibly lead to some kind of trouble. There are many warning signs, there are many indicators that we can see, and we can see them for several years. The problem is, what are, in fact, the entry points for trying to prevent a conflict from erupting or from trying to take place? What are the tools? What is the leverage? What are the resources? What are the things that you can use to prevent conflict? And mediation really is just part of all of that. I mean, we're really working on trying to either prevent conflicts in the short to medium term, or mediation is, of course, also about trying to resolve conflicts when they've already erupted. But frankly, I mean, the problem with that is that it's already very late when you're doing that. So that makes your mediation incredibly, incredibly hard. I think our basic approach is really all about good offices. So Julian mentioned that. I mean, there's one article in the UN Charter, Article 99, that talks about the Secretary General's role in good offices. It's just one article, and basically our entire strategy is based on that, because that's what gives the Secretariat under the Secretary General really the leeway, the autonomy, sometimes little space, sometimes more space to go and do things. Good offices is about preventive diplomacy, it's about mediation, and above all, it's about, when we talked about tracks, it's about track one. So it's really about, you know, the UN dealing with governments, or dealing with governments dealing with another side, but very much on the official level. And I have to say that all of it being said, with all respect to track 2 efforts, track 3 efforts, which we think are really important, and I'll get to them, our bias, of course, is that we work mostly on track 1 efforts. We're an intergovernmental organization. We have a global membership, and that is the mandate that we have from member states. And it's very much about preventing the outbreak, the escalation, the continuation and recurrence of conflict. And so when we do that, we also try and remember that we need to capacitate and facilitate track 2 efforts also, and to engage civil society, and there was mention of, you know, we need to engage women. I think I just want to make one point on the involvement or role of women in peace and security issues. Women are sometimes mentioned in the same breath as there's civil society and then there's women. No, women are very much part of this. I mean, they're equal, they're very much an equal part of the process with men. And the one thing that we're trying to do to change this approach, where women are mentioned in the same breath as NGOs or civil society, or as one more sort of vulnerable group, is to say you must have gender parity in appointments. So with our I mean, the UN has emphasized that in the past, but now it's really beginning to happen. So for the first time in the senior management of the UN, we actually have 50-50 parity amongst all senior managers. The big issue now is, of course, to try and change the number of women who are appointed as envoys and mediators. And on that, we're really failing. I mean, there's a very, very small number of that. And so there's a big push and effort on that. And of course, the understanding behind that is that when you have gender parity, both at the level of senior management of the UN, but also in terms of mediators, the problem somewhat, I think, will be lessened, because you will then have women knowing intrinsically that the kinds of issues they need to push don't have to be treated as a special case. But I digress slightly. So just to add that some of the tools that we use in terms of mediation, in terms of the people that we support, include obviously the greatest mediation actor is the Secretary General himself. So he does a lot of work, not just publicly, but also through quiet diplomacy. So everything that happens in New York in terms of his office is really about him, as simple as basically picking up the phone and calling people on a range of different conflicts. And that's the kind of work we support him on a daily basis. But beyond the, obviously he takes part in negotiations and others, but that's really the public part of his job. But there's most of it you don't necessarily see, because that's good offices, discreet diplomacy. But beyond him are, of course, his special representatives, his special envoys, the people who are the heads of special political missions, or peacekeeping operations. Our special political missions vary in size. It's a catch-all phrase. So some are actual missions with deployments on the ground. Some are missions, say, for instance, as the office of, let's say, the Special Envoy for Syria, which sits in Geneva. Some of them are in support of something like the Geneva International Discussions. So they're very, very different kinds of diplomatic tools under these missions, and we try and support them. In addition, there are also now, this is a newly evolving thing, are the UN regional offices. We have only 3 of them right now, I think. One is in Central Asia, one in West Africa, and one in Central Africa. But the plan is to increase the number of those in a number of regions. Each office trying to do slightly different things, because each region is different, so they have to be very much region-specific. But we see those as sort of a frontline platform for preventive diplomacy. In other words, if an issue ends up at the level of the Security Council, it's already quite late. The whole point of such offices, the whole point of a prevention strategy, is to ensure that it doesn't get to New York, it doesn't get to the attention of the, let's say, the great powers. It should be done and handled on the ground. And I think as far as we're concerned, in our team, the mediation part of the puzzle is also related to how we deploy experts to support the work of different envoys, or even support the work of regional organizations, and that's our standby team. We have one person who's already arrived here who'll be one of your trainers. Another one arrives tonight or tomorrow. So you can meet with them and perhaps hear from their experiences. They're trained mediation experts who live around the world, and we deploy them sometimes at 48 hours notice, but to go and help out with different experts. I think just a few quick factors in terms of what are the things that are required really for mediation to move forward. One is obviously, or the things that impact mediation. I think first, of course, is how the conflict is proceeding. I mean, is it ripe? Is there readiness on the part of the parties to actually accept any kind of third-party role? Secondly, is there political will? One thing is to say, yes, we're willing to talk to people. The other is, do you actually have the will or the political will to move towards any kind of settlement? We have a number of major conflicts, a number of major mediations going on right now for years that are not going anywhere because of the very serious, protracted, blocked nature of those conflicts. And if anything, I think that kind of situation is getting worse, not better. And last but not least, I think despite the nature of these dynamics, which we don't necessarily control, in fact, we don't control, is who is actually the mediator. I mean, it's absolutely important, the nature, the skill, the experience, the political network, the context of the mediator themselves. You can have the best prepared process, but if you don't have a good enough mediator, you probably will have problems. I'd like to go straight now to some of the main challenges that we face in the mediation landscape, because they really do inform how the UN relates to other actors in the mediation field, but how successful or failed we are in some of these endeavors. And I think one of the greatest challenges, the first right off the bat to start with, is the one which is that in this current post-Cold War state, is post-end of the Cold War state, 25 years after the Cold War is over, is the questioning, I think, by a number of powerful states of some of the central premises on which multilateralism is based. I think we had a consensus starting from the 90s. I think that consensus is now completely in question, and that affects the nature of the conflicts that the UN is observing. So the most obvious manifestation of that are the deep divisions in the Security Council. So the kinds of debates we see now in the Council are really the kind we used to see during the Cold War. Real divisions, which means that the political signals that your mediators need to mediate, to do things, those signals, that support is not there anymore. So we're really operating with a high level of, or let's say a low level of political support for a number of our mediation processes due to the polarizations in the Council. Related to this, I think let's say the breakdown of a consensus on a number of things related to multilateralism is, I think, a questioning of a whole bunch of global norms around human rights. And I think that's also beginning to affect a number of the things that mediators do. And this is partially related to the fact that I think this is a bit fuzzy to express, but I think there are a number of new countries that are emerging that are really questioning the global system, for better or for worse. They're questioning the peace and security side, but they're also questioning a lot of what's happening in the global financial side. So I think a lot of things are in flux, and that impacts on us. I think another major challenge that we're facing is that most of our peacemaking efforts, diplomatic efforts, good officers efforts, have tended to center around working through the nation states or through governments. That, in the nature of conflict now, is obviously changing. A lot of people have commented on this, but the fact that there's a growing power and preponderance of non-state actors really does complicate everything that we do. So we're not dealing with just one side. We're dealing sometimes with a number of actors. And the fragmentation of, for instance, let's say armed groups in a conflict means that you need to basically gauge your mediation with each one of them separately and differently. And sometimes that fragmentation can turn into more fragmentation even within those groups. So, for instance, I'm trying to avoid naming places, conflicts, or countries in this, but just to give an example, for instance, in the Central African Republic, we have a fairly long, drawn-out negotiation process with obviously there's the government on the one side, which is really about extension of state authority, but it's also about dealing with a whole number of different actors. Those armed groups, each one of them has a different agenda, has a different motivation. Some of them are purely criminal, some of them are motivated by money, some of them are motivated by trying to gain political power. But as you're conducting those negotiations, they're fragmenting as you speak. So the job of the lead mediator is incredibly hard. Another aspect related to this is who is controlling these armed groups, or who is controlling the non-state actors? Are they proxies for somebody else? So the traditional approach would be you go to the people who are their sort of masters and for whom they serve as proxies. And sometimes that works, but in quite a number of instances, it doesn't work because a number of these groups are not fully controlled or start acquiring their own agendas as they go on in the nature of a conflict. So gauging that, trying to calculate that is quite difficult. As part of a mediation process, you also have to try and find out how the financing of these groups works. Are they dependent on the exploitation of natural resources? Is the financing coming from other groups? Again, this issue of proxies, but also those that become economically independent during the course of a conflict. So I think all of this, of course, leads one to say that the UN has to, but I think the regional organizations also have to, they all have to do a better job of trying to understand local conflict dynamics better. The days of being able to operate at a level of diplomacy that's fairly high or just track one, I think those days are gone. We need to have a better understanding of what's happening at the local level, because that local level is what is informing the higher levels. And so I think being able to understand, but also at times support local or community-based mediation actors is quite critical. So in our team, we're trying to not only understand this, but trying to see how we could better support such actors. I think it's easy to say that you come in from outside and you say, look, we're going to hold a workshop, I'm going to train you local actors in mediation, and then you guys can basically do it better. I think it's probably the other way around, which is that we have to operate with a level of humility and try and understand what they're doing, and then learn from them, and then basically ask them what do they want, rather than flying them off to somewhere for a workshop and basically say we've done our job, which by the way has been the approach, unfortunately, so far. But I think local level mediation will become more and more important as we go on. It's also important because it's going to inform track one efforts, and more I think mediators are going to have to look at mediation with a multi-track approach, so that they won't just be doing mediation in the Palais in Geneva. They will have to engage at different levels, and so they will need different kinds of skills for people in their teams also. So this is just to illustrate that the mediation field, so to say, is becoming much more complicated and much more than what it used to be in terms of standard diplomacy. I think there's just to add here, one question remains, which is that sometimes mediators operating at the track one level keep a distance between themselves and what's happening at the local level, because a lot of work that happens at the local level, be that community level mediation, be that ceasefires, be they sometimes surrender agreements, can tend to really tarnish or complicate things at the track one level. And so it's not a given that you need to always keep these tracks together. Sometimes you need to have some political distance also. I think one other issue that we face in terms of challenges, and that has really muddied the waters when it comes to mediation, is the overall efforts of the international community to prevent violent extremism or the overall counterterrorism efforts. We operate in a world where sometimes you have UN missions deployed side by side with a counterterrorism operation, military operation, and people on the ground don't really often don't distinguish between those two things. So what that ends up doing is that it tarnishes or confuses the efforts of the UN. I mean, if our role has to be about being an impartial mediator, an impartial player, it is affected and is being affected by the global counterterrorism agenda, for better or for worse. So it's something that one has to deal with. I think it's also fair to say, my colleagues here have referred to before, which is that the mediation landscape is definitely becoming more crowded. It's everyone. I mean, there are all kinds of different actors, and some are quite credible, and some are not that credible, and some have ambition and can deliver on that, and some have ambition but then can't deliver on it. So you have a crowded landscape. You have different donors backing different players, and they range from, international, regional, non-governmental organizations to smaller think tanks to bilateral actors. And trying to navigate that is really quite a question for us. I think the ideal case scenario would be that you have one entity or one person in the lead who can try and basically orchestrate. In certain places, the UN can do that, and we aspire to doing so, but in other places we cannot, because we don't have enough either resources or know-how, so somebody else should be doing that. But this is really the ideal case scenario. It often doesn't happen, and so you have situations where a lot of organizations end up, including by the UN or its agencies, in very much a flag-flying mode rather than actually being useful. And it's something that we really need to guard against. And what that brings me is to the next one, which is the role of regional or sub-regional organizations. I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's very much the case, which is that we need to learn from a number of let's say successful prevention stories or successful mediations, which is that the UN or a certain organization doesn't necessarily always need to be in the lead. It can gauge where it can be playing a supportive role, where others can be in the lead, provided it's done in a way that's reasonably well coordinated and well stitched together, and everyone is operating off the same page. So you can have mediators and those who are trying to apply a certain kind of leverage, but they're doing it in coordination. That's absolutely essential. So part of our work is also to work with regional, sub-regional organizations in terms of capacity building, working with them, trying to explain our approaches to them, sometimes having a number of trainings. We talked a lot about media and the role of social media and how that impacts mediations, but I think we did that yesterday, so I won't cover that. But just to say very briefly on that part of that is really about how peace agreements are validated eventually when they've been negotiated. That really does prove whether a peace process has succeeded or not. And finally, just to say that I think we also live in a world where mediators face far higher expectations than they ever did before. I think before the sole criteria was, were you able to negotiate a deal? Were you able to basically stop the violence? I think now we have mediators, not just because there's more public scrutiny, but because we have a whole bunch of standards for them, which is your peace process more inclusive? Is it more representative? Is it more mindful of international norms? I mean, does it take into account human rights standards? Does it give credence to transitional justice issues? All of these can complicate the work of the mediator. So I'm certainly and definitely not arguing that we shouldn't do that, but it's just to recognize that it's a much more complicated agenda for the mediator as opposed to, say, 10 years ago even, or 5 years ago. It's as we develop our theoretical work on these issues, I think it's also impacting on and putting pressure on the work of the mediator. So we need to be mindful of that. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.